So I am Dr. Lindsey Churchill. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Central Oklahoma. I'm also the director of the Women's Research Center and BLGTQ+ Student Center, as well as the director of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies minor. I was introduced to the Herland collection a few years ago, actually probably in 2015, around early 2016. I found out that they had this incredible collection of books that they had since basically the 1980s, and people would come all around from Arkansas, Texas, throughout Oklahoma to see these rare books about gender and sexuality, books written by lesbians, lesbian fiction, some really rare stuff that you just don't find in the state of Oklahoma at all. So I worked to secure a grant. It was part of a U.S. Department of Education grant through the Student Transformative Learning Record to process these books, to work with Chambers Library to get quite a few students. We had like 10 students on the project, and they would process these books and basically see where you could find these books. And most of these books you couldn't find anywhere in Oklahoma, and a lot of them you couldn't find anywhere in the United States. So those were quite rare books. And when they processed them, they put them in a system, and it helped to create the Gender and Sexuality Studies Library, which is in the center. So it's kind of like the main piece that ties us all together when we come together for different programs or studying, things like that.
Okay. And as a historian, why is it important to document and preserve this?
Well, I think these stories have not been told. I mean, I teach a class called History of Sex, and even when we talk about LGBT history, it's usually the history of gay white men, which is an important history as well, but a lot of LGBT history has left out women. And in part, that's not anybody's fault, because there just aren't the sources there often. But in other times, there's not the support there to preserve those sources and resources that exist. So that's why we're so thankful for this, because, I mean, this is an incredible group. I mean, they were started in the 1980s. They were a lesbian feminist activist group, and they preserve books that we wouldn't have otherwise. This is a part of our history, a part of the community's history, and it's a part of UCO history now, which is really exciting, because I love to see, you know, very young, well, I don't see this in all ages, though, getting accustomed to these books. I mean, I have some of my younger students say, like, I haven't been in the library and touched a book in so long, and that kind of breaks my heart. So it's good to see them, you know, and they identify as LGBTQ+, and that's their history too, and they're able to touch something, experience something from a time decades ago, and so they get that understanding of what people went through to get us to the point we are today.
So, okay, tell us a little bit about Herland itself, your knowledge of it.
So they started in the early 1980s as a bookstore, and as time went on, they wanted a space, their own space, where they could, you know, host musical acts. They could, and I'm going to get the dates wrong, so I apologize on that. I can get the book out for the exact date, but basically, they wanted a space where women could go that was not just the bars, because at the time that was the main place for the community to meet was at bars. So this was an opportunity to meet outside of that, to do things like they had retreats where they would go and camp, and those were women only for quite a while. They would have movie nights. They would host and support female musicians. They even created a CD. It's really cool. So they did a lot to support women in the community in different ways that were outside of just the bar scene. And
I've in going through their things, I've seen a lot about political activism. If you want to expound on what they did in that area. So
they were involved in Take Back the Night. They were involved with OU's women's programs. They did a lot with that. They were involved with Fox v. Fox, which was a case that basically said that a woman could have her children taken away from her because she's a lesbian. And so they got involved heavily with fundraising for that. That was really important. I know they're involved with like all these different, like NOW and other groups. They also provided support for HIV activist groups in the 80s and 90s. So they worked alongside those groups as well. Okay, so they still have their house, and they've kind of reconfigured it since generously donating those 5,000 materials to us, which also don't just include books, they include records, different newspapers, pamphlets. They just gave us buttons. They gave us just a treasure trove of things. And so they have movie nights there still. They are pretty involved in Pride, so they'll host a picnic at Pride. And so the house is still getting used to this day, which is really great to see it continue. It's just kind of morphed, which is, how activism survives. It has to be flexible, right? It has to modify itself with the times, and I think that they're doing that, and they're preserving this part of their past by giving all these materials to us, and then looking forward.
And so they're evolving instead of, because a lot of the LGBT community seems to have a generational gap in their groups.
Right, and I think that this project that they worked on was one way to do that, and I think they're aware of that, and I think that's one of the ways they were able to expose and let people know that this group even existed, because community meant something. And that's one of the questions we ask in the documentary: what does community mean to you? What did it mean to you then? Because we look now, and the internet is great. It's a double-edged sword, though. You don't have to necessarily go out into the world, but then if you feel all alone, if you're a kid in the middle of nowhere in Oklahoma, and you're questioning your sexuality, you can find a community online. Well, people who were in Herland in the 1980s and 90s, early 90s, they couldn't necessarily do that. So this offered that physical space. So it makes me think about that, like what community means. And so I'm proud that we do a lot of social media stuff at the center, but we also have this physical space. I think that's what it is. It's the fusing of all of that, because, activism on Facebook and the internet is important, but it's also important, if you can, to just show up, if you're able to be there physically as well. So it's
Tell us about the documentary from your side of it, how it came to be, what's going on, that sort of thing.
Thank you. So part of that great grant that we got, part of it was to scan all of the Herland newsletters, which we did. They're online. You can find them. You can access them, every newsletter online, which is really cool. And the other aspect was to do an oral history, recording the experiences of women who were in Herland. And so the students, we have 2 students who are editing right now, and they've worked since 2016. So this has been a project that's been going on for several years. They've worked really closely with members of Herland to make it something that authentically displays who they are. And that's what we want to do, is to get out there the things that they've done, how revolutionary they really were in Oklahoma, some of the things that they did, and just that their very existence at that point in time in Oklahoma was a revolutionary act. They were visible, and they offered that space for people. And so I think we're trying to record that. I think the documentary is going to be really exciting, because it's going to tell the origins, it's going to tell what community means to them, and then we can maybe start that discussion and that reflection of what community is and how it has changed.